beamng is one of the most realistic driving games out there, and it's very customizable with tons of mod support, but can you enjoy all that on the go? I recently picked up the Steam Deck, so today we're putting beamng to the ultimate test on it. We're going to look at anything from mods to performance, and see whether it's worth playing when you're away from your PC. Before we jump into gameplay, let's see what beamng actually demands from your hardware and how the Steam Deck stacks up. beamng's minimum requirements are pretty easy to meet. As long as you have a modern CPU and basic discrete graphics card, you should be fine. Just keep in mind that adding mods or increasing the graphics settings is going to quickly make this game harder to run, especially on lower end hardware. Even on my main PC setup, which has a 4090 and Intel 13900K, it doesn't run as well as you'd think it would. The Steam Deck easily clears the minimum requirements and comes with 16 gigabytes of RAM like I mentioned earlier. Its integrated graphics card can't really match a dedicated desktop graphics card, but the RDNA 2 chips hold up surprisingly well at lower resolutions, especially if you can dial in the right settings. I've upgraded my Steam Deck to have 2 terabytes of storage, so we're not going to run out of any room if we can add mods. And on paper, this thing should be able to handle beamng at its lower settings. But the question is, how is it going to actually feel once we're in game? I've recorded this with a capture card, so it shouldn't be affecting performance. We're going to try the Steam Deck preset. I believe I'm going to turn off depth of field and motion blur and leave everything else alone. Well, if first impressions mean anything to you, it took a full minute and 20 seconds just to get past this loading screen here. Then once you're past that loading screen, you have to wait for your truck to load in, as well as some of the other textures. And this took around 1 minute and 38 seconds before I was finally able to see my truck. Once everything loads up, we was able to get around 40 FPS just sitting here at the gas station, but that quickly changes if you try to go into first person. The performance tanks even lower, and it does seem to stay consistently lower. I guess it mainly depends on how complex the interior of the car is, but it just gets even more jarring as you're trying to drive around at such a low frame rate. And all the footage is captured in docked mode, so if you're playing this portably, it's probably going to be even worse for you, unfortunately. West Coast really just runs that bad. And this is also without traffic on the map. So if you're wanting to play West Coast on the Steam Deck, I would say with the Steam Deck official preset setting, it is playable, but it's not enjoyable. Since West Coast is kind of a disaster on the Steam Deck, I decided to load up Italy, and this took around 1 minute to load up, but luckily we didn't have to wait for the textures once this loading screen was finished. So I decided to do the one wheel peel and test out the performance. I drove around the outer ring of Italy with no traffic, and the FPS is very similar to West Coast, but we don't get those frame rate drops nearly as often. So I think it's time to play around with some traffic. So let's go under gameplay and just make sure that they're turned on here. We'll try to start with 4 vehicles and see if that's too much. And this is where I ran into a really big issue. Anytime that I try to turn on traffic with the Steam Deck, it crashes the game. It doesn't matter if I'm trying this on Italy, if I'm trying it on Utah or West Coast. Anytime I try to turn on traffic, whether it be one car or multiple, it would crash my game. After giving up on turning on traffic, I decided to try a much smaller map. The automation test track is pretty small and it doesn't have a lot of foliage, so I thought this would be a good map to try. Once I was patient enough to let all the textures load in, it starts out pretty rough, but we eventually were met with around 50 to 60 FPS using the stock truck. And so far, this was the best experience I've had on beamng with the Steam Deck, so if you're going to try this out for yourself, I would stick to the very small maps like the automation test track or even using the grid map. I got tired of the truck pretty quickly, so I decided to swap over to this car and try it out. The performance is a little bit more spotty with this car, but it still runs fairly decent. Now I think it's time to install some mods. Unfortunately, the game doesn't bring over my already installed mods that I'm subscribed to on my PC, so I just started subscribing to all the car mods that I could see since they're fairly large. And as you can see, installing the mods, there's really no issues. There's no slowdowns while you're trying to download it or anything. You can still see the game playing in the background, so I was actually surprised with how well it does while you're downloading the mods. I did notice, however, after you download all the mods, they don't install right away. It does take some time for that to sync up. So again, you just have to be a little bit more patient. Since we're on the automation test track, I want to try something like this Carbonworks F4. So far, while in the interior view, it's running pretty well. I'm getting like 45 to 55 FPS, just depending on where I'm at on the track. And switching over to third person, we're almost hitting that 60 FPS mark that I wish this Steam Deck would hit. But we do drop down into the 40s, as you can see here. I found that this is probably the most intense part of the track just due to the trees. So I think the Carbonworks F4 is great, but I want to try a car that's a little harder to run. So let's swap to another vehicle. So I had to try this mod out because it looks really crazy. So the outside looks awesome and it's got some active aero. And if we look into the interior, it's got cameras set up for the rear view mirrors. And this one runs pretty well. We do drop into the 30s here, but that's pretty much to be expected with how much is going on with this mod. And switching back over to third person, this car runs about as well as the other cars I've tested. If you plan on modding your experience on the Steam Deck, I would suggest trying out the automation track. It runs pretty well. beamng is a little rocky on the Steam Deck. I wouldn't really suggest it unless you really need to scratch that itch. You can pretty much forget about running traffic, and if you want to run West Coast, East Coast, or some of the larger maps, even like Italy, I would not expect a consistent experience. And the rather unfortunate truth is, due to incompatibility issues, most of the graphics mods do not work on the Steam Deck, so you really can't improve the performance much past the vanilla experience. So I decided to look for two games that run really well on the Steam Deck. I wanted to find a sim racer that runs really well and more of an arcadey type game that has good customization to hopefully scratch that beamng itch. The first game I want to highly recommend is Automobilista 2, which can be found for $40 US. I actually picked this up on sale a few weeks ago, and it's a racing simulator that runs incredibly well on the Steam Deck. You get really good graphics, the audio quality is unmatched with even some of the best racing games I've ever played. You have dynamic weather and track conditions, and it's a really great experience. You're not really going to see a lot of normal or street cars, even though there is some DLCs for that, but overall this game is incredible. I highly recommend that you give it a try. Next up, if you're looking for something a little more arcadey and something with the customization of some of the older Need for Speed games, Car X Street is really good on the Steam Deck as well. Even on max graphics with maximum traffic density with no upscaling, the game runs incredible on the Steam Deck. There is some frame hitches here and there, so I would highly recommend turning the graphics down to around medium and still leaving the upscaling off since it makes the game look very blurry. The game is very arcadey when it comes to the physics. It's not my favorite, but the customization here is unmatched. You can even do engine swaps, so this might scratch that beamng itch somewhat, even though it's not as good. So yeah, beamng's performance really did not impress me on the Steam Deck. I think if the developers continue to work on the Vulkan renderer, things can definitely be improved. But the fact that you can still play some of the smaller maps and even load in with car mods is pretty sick, I have to admit. So yeah, I really enjoyed this type of video, and if you want to see more Steam Deck content, be sure to let me know in the comments below. I want to thank you all for watching. Just don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. It's been Exilent, and I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.